is my intention to look at what we can learn out of it. Now, this is lesson 4. What's the heading? What's the lesson heading? It says an everlasting covenant. I'm hoping that you've had time to study this. But the everlasting covenant is an agreement made. Now, before we go any further, I need to see if you're on the same page as I am. Do you understand what the word covenant means? Okay, it comes from the Hebrew word berith. Do you remember that? In your lesson studies, you were supposed to have a look at it. And the word berith actually doesn't just say an agreement between two parties. It actually uses a wording that makes you understand it's a binding agreement between two parties. Did you understand that? It's not just an agreement where both persons just sign because they have to, but they actually are willing to bind themselves to this agreement. So I want you to recognize that when we talk about the everlasting covenant, we've moved away just from the word covenant and we've actually been introduced to the word everlasting. And I kind of wondered to myself, what does that mean to you when you hear the word everlasting? Now, let me give you an example of what I'm trying to figure out. When you get married, those of you who are married, when you stand in front of the church and you've got a whole lot of witnesses, and you've got the minister and then you've got the bride and the bridegroom together, part of the agreement is that this will be everlasting. And the way we do it, we say, until death do us part. Isn't that true? Through sickness and health, through prosperity and adversity. We make it very clear that this agreement that you have amongst one another in a marriage relationship is in some sense almost like an everlasting agreement. And what is important to recognize is that both are willing to go into the agreement. Do you understand? Now, there is a difference when it comes to the covenant agreement that God establishes with us compared to the marriage agreement. The marriage agreement is when two parties of equal standing get together because the woman is equal to the man and the man is equal to the woman. There isn't a head and a foot in the story. It's from the side. They are companions. So both of them, in some sense, had an equal say in the establishment of the agreement. The wife will give her side of it, and I will do this. And the husband says, yes, I will do that for you. And we have that quite clearly established even in the book of Ephesians. Husbands, love your wives as you love yourself, and wives, be subject to your husband. The counsel is already given there. But now the interesting thing, the covenant agreement with God is not on the same terms. The covenant agreement was drawn up by one party. The covenant agreement was drawn up by God. You didn't sit down with God and say, let's draw up an agreement between you and me, because that's what we like to think, that we have an equal say in the matter. But not really. Here you have to accept that you are subject to God. How many of you like that? Yes. Oh, you like it. That's good. You see, part of this whole covenant agreement, God is not forcing you into this relationship. He is allowing you choice. But you will not accept it unless you feel that there is some benefit for you in it. Do you understand that? I want you to look with me, and we're going to start, and I want to get into it. The memory text, Genesis 17, verse 7. And it's out of the Revised Standard Version that we have it there in the lesson study. I, which is God, so I want you to notice who's establishing it. I will establish my covenant between me and you. Who establishes it? God does it. I want you to understand, dear friends, that there is no sitting down with you and drawing up, what do you think about it? None of that. God says, I'm establishing an agreement between you, me and you, and he's talking to Abraham here. But we have the word Abraham, but it wasn't initially Abraham, it was Abram. And your descendants after you throughout their generations and then it says, everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. So he's saying there that part of this whole agreement is that I am going to be the God of your people. Do you understand? God is actually saying the covenant agreement is this. You will accept me as God, and your descendants will accept me as God, because I'm God to all of your people. That's what it's saying there. Now, the interesting thing is we have this word everlasting. Now, I'm intrigued by this word everlasting here, and it gets us to start looking at the rest of the lesson. Now, the interesting thing is that the lesson isn't going into depth regarding the arrangement or the agreement between Abraham and God, but it is introducing us to one of the most important principles here, and that is the word everlasting. Now, what does the author do to try and get us to consider this word everlasting? What did we have to look at? Now, if you look with me, Sunday section, we aren't introduced to an agreement, we were introduced to a name. And the name is Yahweh. Okay, very interesting. And then the author goes to great detail to try and explain what the word Yahweh means. But basically, simply put, the name means I'm forever there. I've always been and I always will be. I am God. So basically, the name already is saying that the person who's drawing up this agreement is already everlasting. Do you understand that? Now, dear friends, listen to this carefully. It's not an arrangement that's temporal, because one of the parties is everlasting. But are you everlasting? Are you mortal or immortal? You're mortal. How can you go into an agreement with somebody who's everlasting where you are not everlasting, you die? How can this be an everlasting agreement? Yes.
Well, I think it's fairly simple. Because if you say everlasting, that means it lasts forever, right?
Correct.
So, and if we look further, we see also that in verse 8 it says, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. So there we have an everlasting possession and we have an everlasting covenant. So even if we die, and those of us who are faithful in the third end of the message, we know that there will be a resurrection for us. And we can come up again, and from that time we will live on forever to continue where we left off with.
So what have you introduced, which is so interesting? The most amazing thing about this everlasting agreement is that God is actually saying something to you which most people don't realize. This agreement is not just for your lifespan, but for eternity. Which means, dear friends, and I want you to understand this, that the agreement you're going into now is one that will continue throughout eternity. Because God has in mind, just as clearly brought out, that you are going to be eternal. You see, God sees it. Now, I want you to understand, this isn't an agreement that is adapted to you while you're on planet Earth. Do you understand what I mean by that? It's not like, okay, you are sinners now at the moment and you're going to die, and therefore, but we're going to readapt the agreement later on. This agreement that is drawn up is an agreement that is binding now as well as in eternity. So if you do make it to eternity, you can't turn around and say to God, I'd like to change the agreement now. No, you already agreeing on the agreement here. And the agreement is eternal. Now, straight away it's saying, are you willing to accept the condition that God will be your God, not only while you're on planet Earth, but one day in heaven? Will you accept God to be your God? You see, and I want you to understand something. The commitment that you're making now is really an eternal commitment. So let me give you an example. Go with me to Hebrews chapter 1. Now, no, you didn't have to look at this in your lesson study because you didn't have to go to the book of Hebrews, but I want you to see something that happens in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 1. Now remember something that we need to pick up about this agreement. As I've been saying, I'm going to keep repeating it. You did not draw up this agreement. God drew up this agreement. Okay. It has now become an internal agreement. Now the agreement is binding, as we say. It binds two people together. Now as we go on in this agreement, you'll notice that there is a certain adaptations made in the agreement. And for the first time, we had the covenant introduced. The first time the word covenant was introduced was when? The word covenant was introduced when? With Noah. That's correct. That's the first time we ever get the word covenant. Now, in the interesting thing there, God places in the sky a rainbow, which was to be a sign of the covenant. Do you understand that there is a covenant agreement between Noah and man, well, between God and mankind? And what is the part, what does the rainbow actually say that is interesting when it comes to the way in which the use of covenant is done there? What is the rainbow actually telling us, or even reminding God of, as he says, I'll be reminded by this sign? What is the covenant reminding him of?
He will not destroy this earth with a flood.
He will never destroy this world with a flood again. Do you understand that? Okay, dear friends, how binding is that? How binding is that? Notice it's in the covenant agreement that God makes with mankind. And yet, what do we have the world worrying about? What do they say is the world going to happen to the world, or is happening to the world because of the polar caps melting and because of climate change? What are they saying is happening to the world? They say it's going to be destroyed by flood again. There's going to be a worldwide flood. And in actual fact, they're already saying certain islands that you see now are disappearing. They say that if things carry on as it is, the world is going to be covered by water. Now, do we agree with that? You see, we can't agree with that. As scientifically as they make it, as true as what it is that there's a rise in water, the Word of God makes it very clear that the covenant is binding between us, mankind, and God, that there will never be a worldwide flood again. The world will never be destroyed by a flood. Now, just as that is real, what does the everlasting covenant now help you to understand? Can it ever change? Can there ever be, because of circumstances, a change? The everlasting covenant is a better covenant than the covenant that there would be no flood. Why is it a better one? Just think, just help me. What's going to happen to this world? Is this world ever going to be destroyed by a flood? No, never ever will it be destroyed by a flood, because that is the covenant agreement. But why is it only temporal? Because this world is temporal. God says, I'm going to create a new heaven and a new earth, and the first heaven and the first earth as we know it now will be gone. So, will there be a flood in the new heaven? No. So the covenant agreement, which is particular to Noah and mankind, is binding. That's why I said to you, that covenant wasn't eternal. But now, in the Abrahamic covenant, we are introduced to the word eternal. But you just read quite correctly that Abraham was 99 years old when God approached him. How old is God? Good answer. It's eternal. How long is eternal? It's infinite. So here we have God, and if we see how God is sometimes described in the Bible, he's described as a person with black hair or blonde hair. What kind of hair is he usually described as? White. Why will it be white? I mean, there's a few people like Nick in here that's got white hair. What do we know about Nick compared to, what's your name?
Cuban.
To Cuban. Did I say correct?
Cuban.
Cuban. Not from Cuba. Cuban. So like with Cuban, he hasn't got a grey head on his head compared to Nick. Now what do I know about the two of them that already tells me just by the hair?
The one with the grey hair is older.
The one with the grey hair is older. Do you understand? When God is portrayed, he's referred to as the what of days?
Ancient.
The Ancient of Days. He's the Ancient of Days. There isn't somebody older than him. But he goes to a person who we call old, because, any person here that's 99 yet. Do we have a 99-year-old person here? Maybe 100? No, we don't have. Now, if we had a 99-year-old person sitting here, we would honestly refer to that person as ancient. But in comparison to God, how ancient is that person? I'm always amazed at Enoch. Can any of you tell me how old was Enoch when he had Methuselah? He was 65 years old when he had Methuselah. That means some of you who are 65 years old now can still have children. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? When you look at the way that God looks at things, he doesn't see things in the small bracket of time. So let's come back to the word Yahweh. What is the interesting thing about the word Yahweh? It has no beginning and it has no end. Whereas Abraham was 99 years old. What's that already tell you about Noah? Abraham. What's it already tell you about him?
There was a beginning.
There was a beginning. Whereas Yahweh, no beginning. Do you understand what I'm saying here? So already when we're talking about the everlasting covenant, I want you to understand that this is a covenant agreement that was there already before Noah was even born. So we are not being introduced to a new covenant. In actual fact, this covenant that we are talking about is a covenant that has actually had its existence as long as God has been in existence. And it has been his covenant agreement with all creation, that I will be the God and you will be my people. Do you understand that? So all that is really happening is that we, as a group of people living on planet Earth, which were estranged from the covenant, are now willing to agree to go back into the covenant. So the difference is, it's new to us because of the fact that we hear about it for the first time. But it's always been there. Dear friends, I want you to really try and grab this. I want you to understand that when you accept these conditions, you are actually agreeing to go back into the original arrangement that God actually had with Adam and Eve. Do you understand this? We were estranged from it because of sin. Sin broke that covenant agreement between us and God. But God hasn't set aside that agreement. He's actually bringing us in harmony to the agreement. Otherwise, we will never be happy in heaven. The interesting thing in the book of Hebrews chapter 1, which I wanted us to get back to, was that God turns around and he says to the angels, long before we were even in the picture, that he says to the angels, and I want you to read this with me. If you look at verse 6. And again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, now his firstborn was who? Jesus Christ. Okay, I want you to understand, because the Bible says, for God so loved the world that he gave us what? His only begotten Son. So his firstborn, in a reality, was Jesus Christ. Now, I don't want to get caught. Yes?
I saw there was a reading from the King James. It says begotten.
Begotten. And
The word begotten.
and the interesting thing, when you read the word begotten, what's that mean? You know, the word begotten should challenge your thinking straight away. But I'm not going to go there, seeing that you're not sure. So look at verse 6. And again, when God brings his firstborn or begotten into the world, he says, let all what? God's angels what? What's it say there? Worship him. Do you see? I want you to understand something. There was worship before we were even made. God actually made everything with the purpose that everything will recognize that he's God. How do we know that worship is an acknowledgement that God is God? Did my question sound complicated? You are all worshiping God here today, isn't that true? Why are you worshiping God? Because he told you to. Because you love him. But I want you to understand something. You need to recognize the covenant. We need to worship God not just because he calls us to it or because we love him, but that in actual fact is showing that we recognize that he is God. Worship is a sign that you recognize that God is eternal. Do you understand that? Dear friends, I want you to look at it this way. What's the first commandment say? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. What else does it say? Thou shalt not bow down thyself or serve them or worship them. Because when you worship something, you're acknowledging it as greater than. So when you came to church today and you decided today we're going to go to the house of the Lord to worship God, you, without really knowing it, were acknowledging that God is everlasting. He is eternal. He is, by rights, entitled to worship. And we recognize that. Do you understand? Now, there's a reason why I'm bringing this out. I want you to see something with me. This covenant agreement. So go back to now I'm going to use the interesting thing here, and we're going to use Exodus to bring a point home that the author actually brings with it only when he introduces us to Abraham, because the word everlasting is introduced there. You saw that. We saw that the memory text introduced us to the word, I'm going to make an everlasting covenant with you. Now, in order to know what the word everlasting means, we went to the name Yahweh. Okay. And Yahweh basically means the all-existent, continually existent, forever to be existent God. Now, what's it already saying to you? Is God never going to be in the picture? Is God always going to be in the picture? Dear friends, man, you need to recognize this. This God that you are serving is always going to be there. Now, if you don't like that, then you need to make up your mind not to be there, because he's going to be there forever. It's like in a marriage relationship, when you say I do to your wife or your husband, you must do it in this way that they are always going to be there. Did you hear what I'm saying? You see, what I want you to understand, dear friends, the point that the whole lesson study is all about is emphasizing the word everlasting. And you know, for the first time, you need to understand it's not a temporal agreement. It's an everlasting agreement. And it's and the sad part about it all is, if we don't realize that, how can we make a reasonable or even a fair decision to get involved in the agreement? Do you understand? When I'm using the marriage as an example. When a husband and wife get together, they should know that it's eternal until death put them apart. But what do we have nowadays? Because they said, Moses says we can divorce. Do you remember that? But what is Christ's response to when he says, yeah, but Moses says we can get divorced? What did he say? It's because of you. It's not because of the agreement. So I want to come back to your thought. The sad part about it all is that the people are taken out of Egypt, quite correctly. But they didn't realize that the agreement was for eternal, but so they still had the 1 foot in Egypt still. You see, the whole objective as to why we're looking at the covenant is to realize that we are making an agreement or accepting an agreement with God, and to recognize the responsibility we have. Now, in the lesson study, the interesting thing is that we have the seed, not seeds. Why does God say to Abraham, with your seed? Now, it's interesting. We're not going to go into that now. But I want you to bear in mind, right here in the Abrahamic covenant, which is an everlasting covenant, which was a covenant drawn up by two people who would honor the agreement. Who is the person that we are referring to as the seed that was already part of the covenant agreement in the beginning? Jesus Christ.
And it's very simple, because when God spoke to Abraham, the son of the promise was Isaac. Isaac was to be crucified, and that was typical. Then the lamb was brought forward, representing Jesus Christ.
Correct. So, there's a lot we could do here, but we need to round off now. Lesson study time is up. I want to go to Exodus quickly, just to finish off, because I want you to recognize something. The whole purpose of our lesson study today was to recognize that God, first of all, is eternal. He is the same today as he was in the past, and he will be in the future. You can bargain on that. He is going to be around forever. You can be assured of that. And therefore, the covenant agreement that he draws up is not going to be a temporal one, but an eternal one. Now, the question is, are you willing to sign on the dotted line to be part of the eternal covenant? So, what I want you to see something. In Exodus chapter 3, we have this whole Yahweh story brought out, and that says that Yahweh actually says, it means I am. Noah says to God, when I go to the people and I say, who are you? What must I say? Okay? If you look there, I'm going to start reading from verse 13. Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment. This is chapter 3, verse 13. I want you to look at it this way. You are the Israelites, and I'm talking to you. And I'm like Moses, okay? And I'm saying to God, suppose I go to the Israelites, you people, I want you to see the reality of this, and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, that means you're asking me, what is his name? Then what shall I say to them? So I want you to listen, because you see, you asking a question. Who's this God that has been in covenant agreement with our fathers? What's his name? Now listen to the beauty of this. God responds by saying, God says to Moses, I am who I am. That is what you ought to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. I just want to ask you something. Do any of you understand what I am is here? I mean, have I really answered your question? Who sent you? I am as. Okay. Now, I want you to notice, you looking back in retrospect, you looking back and you can say, we know what Yahweh means. But you didn't have that knowledge. You don't have this knowledge. And I want you to think about it this way. All of you sitting here, at one stage in your life, in your Christian experience, didn't have the knowledge you have now. But what is the interesting thing about that time and now? You might have changed, but has God changed? He's still the same. Okay, so that's what we've all concluded. Isn't that agreement? We all agree that God is forever. The same, remember, he hasn't changed. He is the same. But I just want you to read this. We need to get to it. I am has sent me to you. Then God also said to Moses, and we actually didn't almost read this. God also. He didn't just say I am. God also says, which was part of what we should be listening to. Say to the Israelites, that's me speaking to you now. Say to the Israelites, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Jacob has sent me you. And then he says this. What does he say next? This is my name forever. The name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. So